thank you all for being here today. Reconnaître que je suis un territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Je reconnais la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles je suis aujourd'hui. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations entre les peuples autochtones et les autres personnes au Canada. Last year, we held a three-part roundtable series that focused on the issue of precarity within the ranks of amongst historians, ranks of the Canadian Historical Association. And I think it was a very important conversation that progressed over 6 months and led to a series of specific actions, right, around those core issues. And I think contributes to a recontextualization of precarity away from the notion of meritocracy and the idea that somehow this is an individual failing to wider questions around the structural violence of our labor market within the Academy. This year, we're celebrating and marking our 100th anniversary as the Canadian Historical Association, which offers an opportunity to step back and reflect, right? And to reflect together as a community, as a discipline about, our past, present, and future. Dr. Alison Stevenson has organized a series of panels, and I'll turn it over to her in a second, that focuses on and considers other structures of power and exclusion that of course are connected, profoundly connected with the issue of precarity, but also many other things. And so this is an opportunity over the next 3 sessions, again, to think about our work together and to ground our conversation in personal experience, right? We are historians, but we're also people who have a lifetime investment in what we do. And so I think this opportunity to share with each other is incredibly important. So I'll hand it over to Alice, and I look forward to today's panel, but also the next 2.
Marcy, Stephen, and thank you, Marcy, to everyone that agreed to participate in this panel, and to Michelle also for putting in the labor that brought us together here today. I'm speaking from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan, in the homeland of the Métis people. I am a Métis historian and also the Gabriel Dumont Chair in Métis Studies in the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Saskatchewan. So I want to welcome everybody here today and welcome the panelists as well, and really look forward to hearing about their experiences as women and men in the profession, and how they've shifted the profession to be more inclusive of women's experiences, gendered experiences, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say. So thank you very much, and please thank you, Adele, as well, for taking on this role as our facilitator and chair tonight.
So Tassé Boujou, hello, bonjour. My name is Adele Perry. I'm a settler historian here at the University of Manitoba in Treaty 1 territory, also governed by the promises of the Manitoba Act. I am enormously honored to be here as sort of facilitator of this really auspicious and interesting panel that connects the work of historians and the lives of historians, particularly around questions of sort of gender and sexuality. And with that, I will introduce each of our incredibly distinguished speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. Each of our speakers will share with us for about 7 minutes at the max, and that will leave us with time for questions. So we'll take questions at the end of the speakers. So if you have something you'd like to raise the speaker, I encourage you to note it down. And then when we're in the discussion component of today's proceedings, we can take those questions then. So our first speaker will be Veronica Strombogue. She is emerita at the University of British Columbia, where she was the founding director of the Center for Women's and Gender Studies. She is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a winner of the J.B. Tyrrell Medal for Historical Excellence, and a member of the Order of Canada. She was also my undergraduate prof, but that is a bit of a side note. She'll be speaking first. Second, we'll be joined by Linda Keeley. She is a professor emerita in the Department of History at the University of New Brunswick. Her work is focused on women, labor, and the left, and women's work in healthcare. Her most recent publication on Canadian women's and gender history appears in a companion to Global Gender History published in 2021. Our third speaker will be Joan Sangster. She is the Vanier Professor Emerita at the Trent University and has written extensively about working women in the labor movement, the history of the left, feminist theory and historiography, and the criminalization of women and girls and Indigenous women in the law. She is a fellow of the Royal Society and has held the Killam Fellowship and is a past president of the Canadian Historical Association. Her most recent book is Demanding Equality, 100 Years of Canadian Feminism. Our fourth speaker will be Kim Anderson. Kim Anderson is Métis. She is an associate professor in the Department of Family Relations and Applied Nutrition at the University of Guelph, where she holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Relationships. She did her PhD in history at the Department of History at Guelph, which resulted in her much loved and often reprinted and taught book, Life Stages in Native Women, Memory, Teachings, and Story Medicine, published by the University of Manitoba Press in 2011. Our next speaker will be Valerie Kornick. Valerie is the A.S. Morton Chair in History at the University of Saskatchewan. She's an award-winning author and teacher, a fellow of the Royal Society, and her most recent book is Prairie Fairies, A History of Queer Communities and People in Western Canada. She has just concluded a term as Vice Dean of Faculty Relations and is getting back to new research on love, litigation, and marriage, which explores the international implications of Canada's same-sex marriage legislation. Our next speaker will be Rebecca Sheffield. Sheffield is an archivist and educator based in Hamilton, Ontario. She is the former executive director of Archives. I always trip up on that one. LGBTQ plus archives, and has taught archival studies at UBC, the University of Toronto, and Simmons University. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto's Mark S. Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, and her most recent book, Documenting Rebellions, traces the history and impact of 4 lesbian and gay archives. Our final speaker will be Taylor Starr. Taylor is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at York University. Taylor has worked on research projects at the Canadian Museum of History, University Historical Project on Egerton Ryerson's life and legacy, the BBC, and was faculty at York University. She is a Shirk Doctoral Fellow and the recipient of the 2021 R. Roy McMurtry Fellowship from the Osgood Society for Canadian Legal History for her work on the dissertation, which she'll be getting shortly. Our other speaker that will be joining us will be Stephen Maynard. Stephen is an adjunct associate professor in the Department of History at Queen's University, where he teaches the history of sexuality. Stephen has been involved in the queer movement for many years and is co-chair of the Canadian Committee on the History of Sexuality and the author of many significant books, articles, and other forms of scholarship on queer and gender histories. And it is with that that I will begin our roundtable, and I will do so by turning things over to Nikki Strombogue.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody for organizing this. And of course, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking on Indigenous land, as we all are. Okay, in Canada, the history of women emerged as a public and scholarly practice in the 1970s. Early practitioners, such as myself and others, are readily stereotyped as beneficiaries of post-war prosperity, but seeming commonality obscures divides. As the daughter of an immigrant waitress who only much later became an English teacher, I never forgot that tips kept us from homelessness. Haunting school readings like Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country and Anne Frank's Diary, an immersion in tales of Scotland's Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, and Flora MacDonald, and Canada's E. Pauline Johnson highlighted the value of resistance, alliances, and words. So did my life in women's history. Protests from women, workers, Indigenous people, and French Canada made it exciting to be alive in the 1960s and 70s. As a scholarship student at the University of Toronto, I played and worked hard. Post-war optimism and my own naivete propelled me into graduate school at Carleton in Toronto, where the emphasis on human agency and pre-World War I decades fed dreams of a worthier country. My first forays into women's history, studies of Nellie McClung and the National Council of Women of Canada, relied on unprecedented scholarly admission that women had a role in the national story. But no female faculty taught me until 1971, when the Americanist Jill Conway and the early modernist Natalie Zeman Davis changed my world with their survey of Canada from the 12th century to the present. Feminist challengers to the departmental politics, Jill and Natalie insisted on women as historical agents and modeled scholarship attuned to contemporary women. I was swept up in their enthusiasm, like that of the suffragists before them, for public trailblazers and troublemakers, so-called women worthies. Alongside other graduate students such as Wendy Mitchison, Jennifer Stoddard, Marie Levine, and Carol Lee Backey, I tackled Canada's early feminist and welfare state activists who championed equal pay and an end to violence. By 1975, when I finished my doctorate on the NCWC, published in 1976 as the Parliament of Women, which recognized class and ethnic divides, feminism was central to my scholarship. However cautious it now appears, recovery of such mainstream women was often judged professionally marginal and politically provocative. That cool welcome helped produce the Canadian Committee on Women's History in 1975. Fanned by hopes to link French and English-speaking feminists, much like today's efforts to build settler Indigenous alliances, it fosters friendships that now flow into new generations. Success owed much to the CCWH's founders' alliances with labor historians. Indeed, as with Linda Keeley here, they were often one and the same. A feminist labor studies partnership, reminiscent of what occurred in Britain at much the same time, underlay much Canadian women's history. One outstanding expression was Joy Parr's The Gender of Breadwinners, Women, Men, and Change in Two Industrial Towns. My own more modest approach to female workers began with the causes from domestic violence to wages embraced by suffragists. My second monograph, The New Day Recall, Lives of Girls and Women in English Canada, 1919 to 1939, reflected this perspective. Just as influential was women's studies. Likewise, a product of the 1970s, it sustained feminist critique of the status quo, forged essential coalitions, and fostered understanding of intersectionality. Many historians committed to women's studies programs, as I did at Concordia and SFU. The Montreal massacre of 14 women in 1989, like the murder of Canadian historian Marta Danilevich in 1985, confirmed my commitment. A belief in history's special role in redress underpinned multiple editions of Rethinking Canada, The Promise of Women's History. Successive editors, including the chair of today's webinar, echoed that connection between past and present. My first appointment at Trent in 1974, with its introduction to Native studies, encouraged a far harder look at colonialism, but investigations by historian Sylvia Van Kirk and anthropologist Jennifer Brown, as well as post-colonial and anti-racist scholarship more broadly, were pivotal. By the 1990s, such catalysts directed my interest to studies of the Mohawk English-Canadian writer-performer Pauline Johnson with SFU English scholar Carol Gerson. Johnson was another woman worthy, but her biography by allies, as Carol and I termed ourselves, highlighted colonialism. In moving to UBC as director of the Center for Research on Women in 1991, and soon the sponsor of a UBC SFU federally funded Center on Violence, with its contact with female, often Indigenous survivors, I struggled to find institutional space. Partnership with sociologist Gillian Crease and studies for the BC Federation of Labor extended scrutiny to neoliberalism's assault on women and children. In linking history to modern tragedies, I found UBC often unhelpful. I sublimated frustration by writing Finding Families, Finding Ourselves, English Canada Encounters Adoption from the 19th Century to the Present, 2006, and Fostering Canada, Canada Confronts Its History of Childhood Disadvantage from 2011, which condemned patriarchy, class society, and racism and colonialism. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, assault on human rights, I returned to the irrepressible suffragists, McClung and Lady Aberdeen, founder of the NCWC, and the complete autobiography of McClung in 2003 with Michelle Lynn Rosa, and Liberal Hearts and Coronets in 2005. Both emphasized activists' dependence on partnerships, and the latter incorporated masculinity into women's history. My most recent contributions, editorship of UBC Press's series on Canadian suffragists and democracy, The Last Suffragist Standing from 2018 on Laura Jameson, a CCF pioneering MLA, and Liberal Labor Lady from 2021 on Mary Ellen Smith, Canada's first woman cabinet minister, returned to suffragists as both flawed and courageous. They call to mind, I think, recent biographies of feminist activists by my Quebec contemporaries, André Levesque, Marie Levine, and Michel Jean. I cannot speak for those women and friends, but my trajectory reflects the rewarding, sometimes painful lessons learned during my journey in women's history. Women's stories remain center front, but my perspective now stresses diverse resistance to oppression, an evolving feminist politics reliant on collaboration, and a scholarly vocabulary rooted in labor, women's, and anti-racist studies. I would not have it any other way. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Nikki. I will now pass things over to Linda Keeley.
Thanks, everyone. I'm very happy to be part of this panel, and I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Wolastoqui, the people of the river, which includes New Brunswick, Maine, and the St. Lawrence River. I want to start by highlighting three themes. First, my involvement in women and gender studies starts with a connection to activism, the social movements of the 60s and 70s, but especially the women's movement, which I became involved in as a student. Secondly, the discovery of an involvement with communities of activists and scholar activists. And that of course, evolved into other forms, especially women's studies and gender studies. And thirdly, a key focus of the early women's movement was on women's work and the politics of challenging inequalities. I think that really fueled a lot of the early interest in the history of women's work. So activism. My involvement in women's groups in those early days helped me to ask questions not only about the present, but also about the past. Thinking about why women and men played different roles. It meant questioning biological determinism and the racism of eugenics. We questioned sex differences, we came to call it at that point, but came to realize the social, political, economic, and cultural constructs that were so key to the creation of difference. Many women like myself in the New Left broke away into women-only groups. We were questioning those biological assumptions, but also the roles women played in the past and why there were so few women in political positions. By the late 60s and early 70s, we had essays and books on women beginning to come out by activists. One such American book, and they were mostly American back then, or English. The preface began, "History as it has been traditionally taught and written has been the story of man, which literally has meant his story and never her story. The politics of women's liberation tells us that history must be redefined." So these early works were eagerly read by young feminists like myself. And we started to think, how could we construct a history of our own in Canada? Of course, as Nikki has mentioned, the emergence of the new labor history, the new social history, also was part of this story, often grounded in left-wing politics, pushing class to the forefront. But we as historians of women wanted to see sex and later gender as a framework for analysis, much like class was. And of course, historians of immigration and ethnicity pushed our scholarship to include this as well in our analysis. Communities of scholars and activists. The Canadian Women's Educational Press in Toronto was my key entry, I guess, partly. into the developing world of women's history. It operated as a collective, which I joined in late 1972. I had been reading the new women's history while working as a librarian and living in a house of history graduate students who never stopped talking about history. With the encouragement and support of my partner and then University of Toronto historian Jill Kerr-Conway, I became a graduate student in history while working with the Women's Press on that collection that became Women at Work Ontario, 1850 to 1930. Most of the authors were activists and not trained in history. We were just excited to be doing this pioneer work and even included a section on how to do research. And of course, similar things were happening in other disciplines. Nikki's mentioned the CCWH. We also had the beginnings of the Canadian Women's Studies Association in 1982, and I was the president the second year. And all of these national bodies of scholars and scholar activists have provided much needed support for individuals. They've also pushed our disciplines towards more equity and diversity, and I think we need to continue to support them and hold them accountable. Last theme, focus on women, particularly women's work in politics. For the early women's liberation movement, women's paid employment and domestic labor were front and center. A growing interest in the history of women's work resulted not only in Women at Work Ontario, but the Women's Press also produced a popular illustrated history called Never Done, 3 Centuries of Women's Work in Canada, also published in '74. This was the work of another collective in BC. And here they acknowledged that their work was applicable only to European women because they knew too little about Indigenous or Asian women. Groundbreaking studies of Indigenous women's roles in the fur trade have already been mentioned by Nikki, that of Sylvia Van Kirk and Jennifer Brown. And more recently, of course, the work of Indigenous women scholars like Kim. I actually wrote this before I knew you were going to be on the panel, Kim. Your work on Indigenous womanhood and works by others like Mary Jane Logan McCallum on Indigenous women's work. All of these things I think are very important in terms of the work theme. By 1990s, we had works on Black women's history, which included Dionne Brand's No Burden to Carry, Narratives of Black Working Women in Ontario, and Peggy Bristow and others were rooted here and they can't pull us up, essays in African Canadian women's history. So things clearly have evolved and changed and for the better, I think. As women's history emerged as a field, so too did labor history. Initially, the overlap produced interest in working class women's work, paid work. I think here of Wayne Roberts' 1976 pamphlet, Honest Womanhood, which focused on working class women in Toronto. And there are many more that I could mention, but I'm sure that maybe Joan will help fill this in with her remarks. Interest in women on the left emerged in my own work on women in early socialism, of course, on Joan's early work on women in the CCF and the Communist Party. An important rethinking appeared, I think, with Bettina Bradbury's 1987 intervention, talking about reconceptualizing the working class by integrating women's work writ large, not just waged work, but the role of women's domestic labor and the importance of the family economy and the family wage ideal. Historians of immigration and migration also pushed the envelope for us in the 1980s, fueled by the work of the Multicultural History Society of Ontario. One of their publications, which I remember with fondness because I knew Varpu Lindström quite well, her book Defiant Sisters on the largely working class migration of Finnish women to Canada and into domestic service. And of course, Franca Iacovetta's numerous publications have focused since at least the 80s, not only on Italian immigrants, but also she has been involved in several collections drawing attention to the history of women migrants more generally, not just European women. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm going to respect Adele's timeframe. But what I've highlighted in these reflections are the developments of the first decades of women's history in Canada from my point of view, emphasizing the connections, at least in the beginnings, between the women's movement and scholar activists searching for answers partly to contemporary questions and dilemmas. The historical questions asked are always shaped by our context and our political milieu. The early focus on women's work is one example, and the intersections, of course, with labor history are many. Some noted here, some noted by Nikki, but I leave it to my colleagues to continue that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I will now pass things over to Joan Sangster.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the tiny village of Warkworth, which is on the traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. Rather than focus just on my own journey in history or the historiography, the latter being way too complex to stuff into a few minutes, I thought I'd just start by asking if there's any themes, overarching themes that we could talk about over the last decades that characterize women's and gender history, which I will shorten to women's history. First of all, I think we might talk about our aspirations. Many practitioners of women's history aspired to link the past, present, in the hopes of a different future, though how that aspiration materialized changed over time. They wanted to take history to a different level, to question sources, the whole narrative of history and interpretations. When I was recently looking at feminist attempts at popular history writing in the 1970s, it was interesting how laudable their aspirations were and that they pushed beyond the bounds of what was written at the time. As one journalist said, if we're going to challenge our current realities, we must challenge a history based on elite, white, middle-class male perspectives, for they're a far cry from historical truth. That in 1976 was certainly more aspirational than real. I think for the very few feminists in my cohort, and I don't use generation, which is age-related, but cohort, we felt that our research connected us to the lives of people in the past in ways that resonated for the present. The past and present collided in our efforts to hope for a different future. Writing history is personal, collective social process, a dialogue in which we thought questions of the present might illuminate the past. And although our writing was bound up with addressing these dilemmas, injustices, and debates, the relationship between activism and history was never simple or linear. They may be caught up in the many facets of our lives, and I don't think we should define activism narrowly, but rather broadly. In the late 1970s, when I went back to graduate school after a hiatus, even posing some of these feminist statements was seen as rather peculiar. We often heard, is there anything there to talk about in relation to women's history? From skeptics who thought that women were hidden from history and they simply could not be found, or maybe they weren't worth finding. Another critique was that any focus on women was ideological, and that's a bad word, ideological, and too narrow since we were ignoring men who they interacted with. I think we have to recognize the realization of some aspirations in that gender and women's history moved from the bad ideological to more of the center in terms of Canadian history. We can register that as a positive while recognizing at the same time that historians continue to ask, whose history are we writing? Whose voices are we marginalizing? Who are we leaving out? That's the inevitable tug of war, or good kind of tug of war in feminist history, where on the one hand, you're trying to create a new history that rectifies past distortions. And on the other hand, you have to always ask, who are we misrepresenting? Who are we ignoring? Because of the social relations of power that operate both in the past and in the present. Second, I think a metaphor of crossroads is a good one to think about in terms of women's history. Women's history emerged at the crossroads of a number of intellectual traditions and social movements, a renaissance in social history, social movements, new avenues in theorizing. And secondly, it was also at the crossroads of international writing. It was also often implicitly comparative. When I began to work on women on the left in the late 70s, it was assumed I should know the American and British history and also Comintern, which are international histories. While being implicitly comparative, we also had our own preoccupations in terms of Canadian women's history. And that may see a contradiction, because on the one hand, we were pushed to think comparatively. On the other hand, we were encouraged to write Canada at a time when knowing ourselves in the Canadian studies movement was quite vibrant. But Canadian studies was never, I don't think, narrowly nationalistic. Being at the crossroads of international writing and theoretical currents is very positive, but it can have limitations. Anglo-American theory making, I think, is often quite dominant, and it's constructed narrowly from histories and experiences of certain groups of people. There are inevitably circles of scholarly power, hegemony, and difference, both within nation-state borders and across the globe, that we always have to think about. Third, I want to talk about reflexivity and standpoint. I think this was always important. Our standpoint, the environment in which we as individuals work and write, mattered to our writing. And we wanted to ask, how did it matter? Should we transcend it? How can we transcend it? How can we make it visible rather than assume a sterile objectivity that did not exist? If international comparisons were productive, I would say our interdisciplinary alliances were too. I was very fortunate in some ways to be hired into period, in the 1980s, but to be hired into a women's studies program, and then later to work in a graduate program in Canadian studies and Indigenous studies, because that teaching always pushed me in new directions intellectually, and particularly on the labor side, it was very productive to be working and reading historical sociologists, feminist political economists. I was going to end by talking about how we've enriched the field of studies of history generally, but I'm just going to make 2 quick points as I end. I think we also have to beware of progress narratives, which my talk just sounded like, I can tell you, because we shouldn't be too self-congratulatory, and sometimes past positions are worth defending. And second, although a collaborative effort, we should not over-idealize women's history, making it difficult to debate the very real differences in our work, which Nikki pointed to. We're not a homogeneous group, and the mark of a more self-confident field might be one that has enough openness to debate theory, method, evidence, and approach, and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. I will now pass things over to Professor Anderson.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am coming to you from Treaty Lands and Mississauga's of Credit, Dish with One Spoon territory here this beautiful afternoon. I'm going to start out by reading a quote from my book on life stages of women from Danny Musqua, which just talks a little bit about why and how I got into doing history and why I feel like I still don't belong. So Danny says, we never had any doubt that women were the center and core of our communities and nations. No nation ever existed without the fortitude of our grandmothers, and all of those teachings have to be somehow recovered. And it will be up to these young people, well, like yourself, he told me, young women that are just digging up and going around, they've got to dig up the medicines to heal the people. And the medicines in this case are the teachings. They've got to dig them up. You've got to find them. So Danny told me that before I started doing a PhD in history, and it was in the context of other work that we were doing on creation stories and all sorts of other knowledge that I was working on. And it kind of coincided with my thoughts around wanting to write a book on life stages of women and figuring out like how I was going to, first of all, buy the time to do that, because, you know, I was working as a consultant. And I just, you know, oh yeah, I'll get to that, doing that work, right? And then I thought, well, if I do it as a PhD, it'll have to get done. Right? But also it was just a compelling feeling when he told me that there was work that to be done, and I could put myself in a position to do it. So I approached, I mean, I was thinking to myself, well, I wonder how historians do this work. I wonder what historians do, and foolishly decided to do a doctorate in history, having only ever taken one undergraduate course in history, which I flunked. I flunked out of, and I hated it. It was British history. I just failed it, and it was awful. So anyway, I went to the history department at Guelph. I went to Guelph because it's the city where I was living in. I couldn't move my kids, so I might have chosen a different place to do the study I wanted to do. But I was like, I can ride my bike over there. They work on doctorates, I think. I'm gonna go over there. And when I went to the Department of History, they kind of looked at me at what I was going to do, which was based on digging up these stories. And they was like, well, you need to go to School of English and Theater Studies. And I was like, I don't want to go to School of English and Theater Studies. I want to do it in history. I want to find out what historians do. So they let me in on the basis of my publications, and Terry Crowley, bless his soul, took me on as a student. And, I got in there and I was doing, I said, okay, I got to do all these other, other things. I've got to figure out how to do archival research, which I've never done, and so on. And Terry just said, no, it's too much. Just go for the oral history. And I really respect and appreciate him for protecting me, for giving me space to do that, and allowing me to spend the amount of time that it took to be able to do a thesis pretty much based on oral history, which, as we know, has its own, own challenges in the discipline. And one of the reasons why I wanted to, I'm kind of a nerdy person and kind of introvert. So I'm very, very happy in a library or in somewhere in an archives where I can hide out and dig around things. But I feel a certain responsibility to gather stories among the folks that will pass at some point, and with them, we lose that knowledge. So I've always worked in oral history, interviewing, like that's been pretty much my whole career, because I feel like somebody's got to get out there, like Danny said, to dig up the medicines. So I entered into the program in history, and I had to have a pretty quick learning journey, never having done history before. But when I got into doing the field, I did a Canadian history field, and I just kind of like, well, we still can't really I can't really find out what I want to know about Indigenous women. So I'll just read this too from the beginning of my book, because it speaks to that experience that I had. So when I read 20th century history about mainstream North American women and girls, I often think about how different the lives portrayed in the literature seem from what I know of Native women's lives during the same periods. And I think of what we're missing in our North American history texts as a result. Where are the stories of Kokum teaching a 4-year-old how to hunt? The depiction of infants in moss bags watching siblings and female relatives pick berries or Seneca root, the puberty fasts, the fiddle dances and the sun dances, the women's councils, the old woman doctoring with plant medicine. Many of these things were going on in Native women, girls and women's lives, even up to the time when mainstream teens of the 1940s danced the jitterbug, and the 1950s housewives grappled with the feminine mystique. So, I go on to talk about how, in terms of looking at literature, we have to look at ethnographic literature and so on. There's other places that I had to look, and I didn't feel like I was, I just feel like a misfit all the time. I just couldn't fit in. I feel like Goldilocks. I hop around in different departments and different places because I haven't been able to find the knowledge that I'm looking for, that I want to produce. And that's sort of how I've felt about history, and part of why I'm not in a history department, and I've been kind of shy about engaging with CHA stuff over the years. I've been invited to talk basically about how we don't fit, before, and that's what I've done. That's what I've contributed. Things are changing, I can see that. But I guess that's all to say that my practice of doing history has been one that comes from responsibility to community, to heal the people, to dig up the medicines, responsibility to make sure that those things are documented somehow and passed on, and very much based in story and storytelling, which sometimes makes me feel like I can't figure out where I belong and where that fits. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we will now move on to our next speaker, who is Valerie Kornick.
Thanks, Adele. And I want to thank Allison for organizing this panel. I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. It's a privilege to talk about how we came to history. It's also a bit daunting. I grew up queer in Toronto in the 70s and 80s in a very close but conventional middle-class suburban family. And yet I had a father who'd been a displaced person. So I was well aware of life's adversities. And my sister and I were really the beneficiaries of this wonderful world that had been created for us. We were sent to a private school in central Toronto, girls' school, and that really was a mixed opportunity, as you might imagine. It did forge my identity in particular ways. It gave me access to tremendous teachers, particularly history and English teachers, that really sort of set that setting in me, I think, to be inspired by history, to want to research history. But it also gave me opportunity to explore Toronto. And I took lots of time after school, strolling down Yonge Street, and particularly heading to Glad Day Bookstore. And I'm forever grateful to the owners who tolerated my presence, because I bought very little compared to how much I read and how long I stood there. And perhaps today I would be kicked out because I was underage. But as I moved through my undergraduate program and eventually into graduate school, I realized that I was taking every women's history course I could put my hands on. And in those classes, I realized that all my years of reading queer magazines, being the outsider, reading books, mining mainstream popular culture for queer and feminist ideas, playing with various codes of language, dress, behavior, made me a natural for gender and cultural histories. It honed my gender and linguistic observational skills. But naturally, that glib statement glosses over the challenge of having grown up in a difficult era for gays and lesbians in Toronto, before Toronto got queer, as a wonderful book title puts it, when police harassment and prosecution of gays and lesbians just for being in spaces, for reading things like the gay newspaper, The Body Politic, and routine harassment was not unknown. And certainly decades before gay straight alliances or queer allies were a facet of high school. So I came to this world, this research world, initially, I thought, out of a lack of creativity. I researched what I knew and what interested me, the gendering of occupations and then cultural consumers and producers, topics that, while wildly different, shared a strong current of social justice, activists, or change-making at their core. That's a powerfully privileged statement to make. And I had the full support of my family for my undergraduate degree, and later shirked provincial and institutional scholarships to fully fund my graduate degrees. Few today experience university as I did then in the 80s and 90s, and I'm grateful for that support. But it's not to say it was handed to me. I remember undergraduate and graduate history classes where female students were often marginalized, not to mention those of us who were newcomers, queer, feminist, or working class. As the first one in my family to attend university, I didn't actually know grad school existed. I was prompted to think about grad school by a pompous comment that a classmate had made in a third-year seminar class. And that rage in that moment inspired me to go and figure out what grad school was all about. So rage can be a great motivator, and I'm here as indicative of that. So shortly after graduation, despite the odds, a Torontonian with a PhD on Chatelaine magazine, zero knowledge of the prairies, I was hired at the University of Saskatchewan to teach women's history, Canadian history, and whatever else I wanted, just so long as I kept creating classes in gender and sexuality and my numbers were good. So I created all kinds of classes, food history classes, gender classes, sexuality classes, everything. I was a one-person band for many, many years. I was an oddity in an overwhelmingly male department, but because of that, I had the freedom to do exactly what I wanted. And that was a rare privilege that very few people get anymore. Saskatchewan changed me in so many ways that are counterintuitive. I became more critical, more activist in my work, and likely a more nuanced historian than I had been if I'd stayed in the Golden Horseshoe. Prairie Fairies was inspired by the world I saw around me at gay community events, social events, where you'd frequently see grandmothers dancing together, cowboys waltzing, kids on the fringes of these events. And this all ages atmosphere of largely white queer people seemed a world away from Church Street in Toronto. What on earth and where on earth had it come from? How did I wanted to know more about this. And so a Post-it note from a colleague of mine that literally had a name on it, Neil Richards, was the starting point for a 15-year labor of research that shared space with kids and administrative labor and all sorts of things. But in short, I researched what I knew and what I was passionate about, seeking to understand how such mundane moments, reading magazines, coming out as a vegetarian, going to a gay and lesbian dance in the prairies, were political kindling for activism, community building, feminism, or success in life or in work. Perhaps because of these idiosyncratic topic choices, I've been invited to many such panels over the years, New Directions. And I've sought out similar talks and presentations, some of them memorably about this field, gender and sexuality, and whether or not it would eventually sunder Canadian history. Those past panels seem quaint now in this era of Canadian history under the spotlight. It would be my It wouldn't be my work or my peers who would sunder Canadian history. It would be Canada itself, chock-a-block with violence, genocide, systemic racism, sexism, and homophobia. That's produced a very rich vein for those of us interested in critiquing power, the state, gender and sexual laws, norms, or cultural experiences. This era of reckoning is long overdue. It will bring opportunities to engage people in the power and importance of writing history, as it fundamentally challenges and shifts who writes history, who tells history, and how readers, audience, and scholars engage with history. Not all will be open to those challenges, of course. Historical denial, like scientific denial, is alive and well. So from the mid-90s to now, this field has changed dramatically and for the better. It's larger. The output every year in gender and sexuality's history in Canada is, quite frankly, astonishing. Alongside Indigenous settler histories, environmental and health histories, this is one of the key pillars of the Canadian field. The margins, as we used to think of ourselves, have flooded the center. Has this spelled the death knell of Canadian history? I don't think so, but some students and audiences have clearly moved on. Numbers for undergraduate history classes continue to shrink. However, at the same time, this is not entirely a story of success. Sexualities histories have been the poorer relation within the marriage of gender and sexualities. Far fewer job opportunities exist for sexualities historians. Institutional support isn't as strong. Few CRCs have come to sexualities history, all of which spells more risk for graduate students. This is sad and ironic because demand for those histories and interests in queer, trans, and two-spirit histories is very strong outside the academy. Canadian history departments are missing a key opportunity in that. So while the field has changed, I want to make a few key points now about our historiography. Put quite simply, gender history continues to power ahead at a rapid pace, but where we have gaps in sexualities history is what I really want to spend the final few minutes of my time on here. Our sexualities history remains overwhelmingly focused on white, urban, and often middle-class women and men. We're lacking in racial diversity, and in particular, Indigenous histories of queer and two-spirit individuals, communities, cultural and activist organizations. Explorations of rural, small town, and northern experiences are limited, as is the attention to trans histories and activism. Community researchers continue to propel this field in ways that are vitally important. Recent works such as Kevin Allen's Our Past Matters, Stories of Gay Calgary, anthologies like Any Other Way, How Toronto Got Queer, and a forthcoming book, Len and Cub, A Queer History from Goose Lane Editions in Fredericton, are driving innovation and discovery. Finally, it's my hope that the current focus on diversity and hiring policies and practices will yield more queer, trans, two-spirit scholars hired into positions in history departments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker, I will pass things over to Stephen Maynard.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation to participate. I'm coming to you from Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe traditional territories. Thinking about my experience of the history of sexuality and how it's changed within the profession from my start, I'd say almost about 4 decades ago, up to the present, I think I can sum it up by quoting the great B.B. King. The thrill is gone. Now, I'll readily admit that this may have something to do with slouching toward 60, but I don't think it's just that. Rather, what I have in mind are some broad changes in the field over the past several decades, which I think have altered how it feels to do the history of sexuality. So cast your minds back to the mid-1980s, when there were very few, maybe no, courses on the history of sexuality in Canadian history departments, no tenured professors specializing in the history of sexuality who could supervise grad students, no presence or profile really for sexuality within the CHA. Those of us wanting to research and write the history of sexuality had to find people and places who'd support our work. These were often people, and some of them are here today, whose own areas of study were not sexuality, but whose intellectual and political sympathies led them to find a place for us. And then there's the work we did to create a place for ourselves. I remember doing the preparatory work for the Canadian Committee on the History of Sexuality and the support that we got from the then CHA president, Veronica Strombogue. I remember sticking up posters at CHA meetings for those very first CCHS business meetings. Those flyers read, "Sex at Lunch," which raised a few eyebrows in the corridors. But those early business meetings were really well attended, and there was an excitement generated by a new subfield on the block. We also need to remember that a lot of that early organizational activity around the history of sexuality took place outside the CHA and beyond the university. And I recall in particular, it was really important to me, the Canadian Lesbian and Gay History Network and the newsletters that we produced with typewriters and photocopiers and snail mail. Those newsletters forged a real sense of community that was dense, it was dynamic, it connected people not just in Canada, but across the continent. There were also community history projects like Lesbians Making History, and there were, of course, the queer community-based archives. It's not hard for me to call up the real sense of belonging to a network, to being involved in a joint endeavor, one that made it really easy for those of us in universities to also be firmly planted in political and community settings, well beyond the university. I also remember working in the early 1990s at the Toronto Centre for Lesbian and Gay Studies, which was then a bold experiment in community education, entirely unaffiliated with any university. Those networks were incredibly sustaining and vital, and thinking back on them now, I can't really quite imagine how I would have done my work without them. Now, fast forward a few decades. There are courses on the history of sexuality, often even more than one in history departments. Grad students can find historians of sexuality to supervise MA and PhDs, and they get shirks to support their research. The bibliography in the field, the entirety of which, once upon a time, you could read in a couple days, can now stand alone as an entire comprehensive field. Where once there were mainly just articles, there are now whole monographs, from Valerie's Prairie Fairies to Dominique Dagenet's Grossière Indécence. We have anthologies like Marvelous Grounds, Queer of Color Histories of Toronto that are appearing regularly and pushing the field in new directions. At the same time, and I think tellingly, those early community history networks and projects that I just mentioned have themselves now become archival objects and the subjects of academic inquiry. The newsletters analyzed so well by Kate McKinney in their book, Information Activism, the oral history projects preserved by the LGBTQ Digital Collaboratory and El Chenier's Archives of Lesbian Oral Testimony, and those queer community archives captured so well by Rebecca in documenting rebellions. Another sign of the times, the Toronto Centre for Lesbian and Gay Studies has been folded into the University of Toronto's Bonham Centre for the Centre for the Sexual Diversity Studies. And that center offers an undergraduate degree and a graduate specialization in sexuality. All of those developments, which I think usually go by the name of professionalization, are all to the good. But we've been encouraged on this anniversary, not just to celebrate, but to think a little bit critically. And so here are a few thoughts on what I regard as maybe some of the ambivalent effects of professional growth. First, once a field has a good couple decades of its own development behind it, I think it can be easy to lose sight of and fail to acknowledge its own initial conditions of possibility. And on occasion like today, that brings together the history of women, gender, and sexuality, which actually is rarer than we might think. It's important to acknowledge that there would be no history of sexuality without the prior work done by women's and gender historians. Another area that concerns me is the relationship between the academic history of sexuality to the community-based forms of history that also helped give it birth. There are, of course, many of us still doing work that tries to maintain a dialogue between the academic and the political, and things like archives continue to emerge. I'm thinking of the transgender archives at UVic or the Two-Spirit archives at the University of Winnipeg. But I think it's fair to say that when it comes to sexuality, that organic nature of the relationship between communities and academies does not exist to the same degree it once did. Finally, I hear from grad students working in the history of sexuality now that they are experiencing a kind of solitariness and disconnectedness. And much of this, I think, can be put down to the pandemic, but I actually hear them saying something more. I know a small cohort of graduate students, just to give you an example, who wanted to put together a virtual network of people working on the history of sexuality. They combed Canadian History Department websites looking for others. They put out feelers, but the response was not great and nothing came of it. This is so dramatically different from my experience 3 decades ago. And it's not that I doubt them, Looking at the program for the CHA's 100th anniversary meeting, I count about 4 or 5 presentations on sexuality. That's not nothing, but neither does it really bowl me over. The grad students' experience has me wondering, and it's actually their thinking that's got me thinking along these lines, about whether there might be a connection between some of the developments that I've just sketched here really too quickly and too crudely. And that is this: does the increasing distance between the community and movement-based history of sexuality and, some 2 or 3 decades on, the professionalized status of the academic study of the history of sexuality help to account for why some new scholars in the field are feeling dislocated? Is it the lack of a broader, invigorating intellectual and political movement? Put another way, for all its impressive growth, has the history of sexuality lost some of its mojo? B.B. King saying, "The thrill is gone, and it's gone away for good." I hope that's not the case for the history of sexuality. I don't think it has to be, but I think we do need, with the next generation of sex historians, to start seriously thinking about how to get that feeling back. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I will now pass things to Rebecca. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you. I'm coming into your screens today from Hamilton, Ontario. So Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant territory. Thanks CHA and Allison and Joe McCutcheon, who's behind the scenes today, for inviting me to participate in this panel. I will admit I'm a recovering academic and a currently resistant archivist, but I feel that you could never truly leave this world behind, especially with co-panelists as interesting as these. I'm going to take a slightly different tack then and mainly talk about my early life and less about scholarly life, which is good because honestly is very hard to follow Stephen, and he summed up much of what my thinking already is and far better than I could. My interest in women's and queer history and archives has ebbed and flowed over time. I'd like to pinpoint my feminist consciousness to an event that continues to impact me every year, and that was the 1989 tragedy at Montreal's École Polytechnique, when a man murdered 14 women. And this very violent and cruel display of misogyny, it happened when I was just making a difficult transition from childhood to young adulthood. So every year when the December 6th anniversary comes around, I remember this event and reflect on its impact. And what I've found interesting the last few years is that it seems to be mainly women my age or older who post to social media about this anniversary, often with the phrase, "I remember." And you know, something else happened during that period of time. From the mid-'80s to the mid-1990s, that was the United States and Canada in the full throes of the AIDS crisis. And so during this decade, nearly 250,000 people, many of them gay men, died with AIDS. And it's a difficult moment, I think, for gay men and lesbians, because it also meant a transition in social movement momentum from gay liberation and lesbian feminism to a more liberal gay and lesbian rights movement. But more so, the world lost hundreds of stories, artists, educators, lovers, fathers. And there was, again, this great desire to not be forgotten, to never forget those we have lost. So not coincidentally, this is around the time that many lesbian and gay archives were really taking shape and becoming important community organizations. But around this time, I personally was also really desperate to find my own identity. And let me say, coming out as queer in the 1990s, before Instagram, before Wikipedia, before email even, was a process of trying to find information amidst a scarcity of resources, very different than today. And I remember going on a family vacation to West Edmonton Mall and finding a copy of Eric Marcus's book, Making History. This was a collection of oral histories with prominent American gay and lesbian figures. I bought it. I hid it under my coat so that I could take it back home with me without anyone seeing, especially my parents. And I must have read that book cover to cover 5 times. So at the risk of sounding like I'm in talk therapy, thank you for this, I just wanted to demonstrate with this little bit of self-reflection that coming into feminist and queer history and then later coming to archives was something that started really early in my life. I was, from a young age, clued into the fact that important things were unfolding around me in real time. And while I did go through a period of wanting to be inside of activism, I also wanted to be documenting what I was seeing. And so rather than being in it, being almost in it and outside of it simultaneously, I wanted to be, or rather the documentation, a conduit between the events and those who were not at the events, and a conduit between the event and our memory of that event. So I was clued in from a very young age, and I could see systems and patterns where many of my friends and colleagues focused on a lot of the details. But, and I think this veers into a kind of second question here, what are some of the challenges that we experience when we're interested in feminist and queer history? When I did my undergraduate training, was at the University of Saskatchewan, I was able to explore women's and gender studies at a time when women's and gender studies had not yet focused on postmodern discourse. And I'll get to this in a moment, but what this meant was that I learned about women's history from Hildegard von Bingen to Gloria Steinem. I learned about feminist philosophy. I learned about women in public health, women and addiction. I learned about suffrage and women's libers, and Stephen, cover your ears, I did not learn a single thing about Foucault. And imagine how much I needed to catch up on when I went to grad school 10 years later. That said, this education gave me something different than I think our graduates get now. And that's an understanding of women's and queer histories over long periods of time. How we have recorded, or in many cases not recorded, these histories, how records of the past can influence our here and now. I also learned a lot about social movements, and this has come up a lot with fellow panelists here, from the sociology classics, Weber, Marx, Wollstonecraft, right up to Simone de Beauvoir. I soaked it all in, and my second favorite anthropologist, Esther Newton, says, it's kind of like building an ethnography of your own communities, exploring those boundaries, the edges of womanhood, of the collective cultures of queer people, because these were not immediately available to me. So years later, when I made a perhaps critical error to go back to grad school and become a librarian, I jumped on the opportunity to tour what was then called the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives, now the Archives with a Q. And it had this profound impact on me. It was a moment of feeling like I had come home. And the archives, they're such these great technologies for social movements. And I think that's ultimately what draws me to them. But now, if I can take just a moment to reflect on what I've observed since ostensibly leaving the academic world, it's very interesting that I'm sitting on a panel with so many people with prairie roots. My University of Saskatchewan education was at a time when history was an incredibly strong department, an incredibly strong field. It feels like we may be going full circle here. All of the silences and gaps that others have noted on this panel notwithstanding, maybe I'm just a Marxist lesbian at heart, but I do worry that our academic programs, and I think this is what Stephen is gesturing at, have really embraced postmodern discourse and theory, actually moved well beyond it now into the deep, which was so necessary for the discipline of gender and queer studies. It elevates and continues to elevate this area of study, but we maybe have to balance this somehow with materialism and good old feminist praxis. And I find that some of the queer theory that I've taught, for example, is rather ahistorical. So while it claims to examine power and the locations of power, it doesn't always provide room for getting down to an understanding of some of the real practical limitations and opportunities in the structures and institutions that it seeks to dismantle, actually. There's no building up. And in doing some of this theory, I think what's sorely missing is that constructivist or materialist understanding. Because my work is always focused on the question, why did this thing happen when it did? And often the answer is a combination of it took incredible, considerable, long, persistent organizing, like a lot of grunt work, and there was an opportunity. And so I want to understand both of those. And I want to understand the tactics that were used by activists so that I can record them and make them available to others. So I think what's interesting in this whole conversation, I'm kind of coming in toward the end of it, is that it's almost like I've gone full circle from really wanting and craving that almost factual historical background, not because I want to remember names and dates, but because I want to understand the strategies and tactics that women and queer people and trans people took so that I can employ them now at a time where I think doing is just as important as learning about it. So that's kind of where I'm at, and I hope that we get to hear from our final panelist this progression even further. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I will pass things over to Taylor Starr.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you to the organizers and to all of you for joining this important discussion today. I acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that other Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples have also stewarded this land. My name is Taylor Starr. I am PhD candidate in history at York University. My work explores women in the late 20th century Canadian legal profession. My pending dissertation uses both oral testimonies and archival sources to answer the question of how women confronted systemic barriers in their pursuit to leadership positions in law faculties across Canada from 1965 to 1994. At the time, there were 20 law faculties and relatively small numbers of women in teaching positions. I came to this project because I noticed there was a numerical surge of women entering law schools in the late 20th century, but an underrepresentation of them taking up teaching positions and leadership roles within each individual law faculty. In the same way, there was an absence of historiography on this topic. Similar connections could be drawn about the historical profession, and my thinking on such historical issues also informs some current events within the very walls or now digital spaces that we navigate and or have navigated as students in the past. As the graduate student representative on this panel, I think it's important to discuss the community among which I'm undertaking this work within the university history department. As you know, this is a roundtable dedicated to a discussion on women, gender, and sexuality, but it's also extremely important to continue to recognize that gender is not separate from other issues such as race, and when it intersects, racialized women and or other marginalized groups have different experiences. Within my own history department, racialized women and non-binary persons have a fundamentally different experience than myself, which is why I should mention my positionality. I am a white cisgender woman. Although my experience of whiteness is 50% defined by my Polish Jewish father's heritage and 25% Italian Catholic heritage from my mother, two groups in the history of Canada that hadn't been treated like the other 25% of myself that belongs to my mom's heritage, and thanks to ancestry, I know that my ancestors took part in the colonization of Victoria, BC in the 1850s. My whiteness is apparent. I am a settler on this land, but I'm a woman. I've had experiences outside of academia where I felt secondhand embarrassment for groups of men on different occasions telling appallingly sexist jokes, provoking deep laughs from the other men around the room. As Constance Backhouse also recalled in her chapter in Feminist Journeys, I too have been present and held my breath when thinking that the jokes would pass. I've had sexist remarks called at me in my undergraduate front desk receptionist position and clients wanting to go over my head to speak to the nearest manager, which were always white men. I've seen the overrepresentation of men in leadership roles. I've also heard the remarks about sexpot secretaries and nymphomaniacs. People continuously are shocked at my telling that I take up history as a profession, as if I'm unexpected. But then when I tell them I'm studying the early formations of women in professional spaces and feminism, there's almost a sigh of relief. I've also been told that my position in dinner debates is tainted by my feminist leanings. And I felt that those around the room were thinking that the white male history buff must know much more than me. I know that historical examples of representation have much to do with the shock value, or the fact that I feel like I must scream to be taken seriously even in 2022. although I won't, because that would go against my professional conduct. I have not, however, experienced the differences that sexism encounters when it is coupled with racism. I have not experienced sexism at the view of my professors or students, and maybe that has to do with my appearance. I have, however, dressed up to play the part of the 21st century historian, identity formation that demands respect and neutrality. I'm conscious of the way in which professional clothing, such as dress pants and blazers, or maybe not the dress pants in today's context, but my slick hair might make the people around me think differently about the quality of my work. It might be that the profession is still inherently androcentric, and it doesn't expect people like myself or my Indigenous colleagues to take up space within its ranks. On October 25th, 2021, graduate students in my department received an email from 5 of my women and non-binary Indigenous colleagues expressing discontent and pain with the selection of a particular scholar for a historian's craft talk, after their concerns about that particular scholar had already been raised at an earlier meeting. They quote, "As Indigenous graduate students, we have experienced a tumultuous year with the ongoing community investigations of the graves of residential school children," end quote. Even further, in response to the political climate, those same Indigenous students took it upon themselves to organize a panel on their experiences within a colonial history department. It was important that the talk was organized so that our department can work towards the process of decolonization. They asserted, quote, "In the longstanding practice of history, settler voices have long been prioritized, which results in harmful ideologies and continuous colonial practices," end quote. I continue to think about their experience about having to continuously push the barriers and reassert their voices to be heard, reinforcing the continuity of some of the issues that my women identifying professors and interview subjects lived through in the late 20th century. I think about the examples they all recalled to me about faculty meetings. They would say an idea and they would get laughed at or silenced. The same idea would be brought up by a male colleague and regarded as a great idea just 5 minutes later. I think there's much to be learned from the Indigenous graduate student incident about the ways in which that earlier, more implicit signs of subjugation have trickled into the academy today. There is still much to be learned about the relationship between our daily collegial relations and how we write history. As Joy Parr famously asserted in the 1990s, remaining committed to a gendered methodology in our writing of history means that we're beginning by acknowledging diversity and instability rather than searching for an imitation of unity. This does not mean we are being presentist. It means we are recognizing that there are and were differences between us, and we're aiming to imagine how such differences operated in the past. We cannot remove ourselves from the world in which we currently live. That is why we're always walking a tightrope between subjectivity and objectivity. The importance of using gender as a category of historical analysis helps us remain committed to understanding the intersections of oppression in the past. Between the dichotomies where we can historically trace the path of overlooked issues into our current events. Hopefully then we can move into a more equitable future. My pending dissertation is called Invisible Barriers, Gendered Problems in Canadian Law Faculties, because it aims to identify some of the ideological constraints that made their way into the legal academy in the late 20th century that prohibited the access and inclusion of women and feminists in leadership roles. Although the last 3 decades of that century are often historicized as achievements of women and marginalized groups, there were bits of that history that often go overlooked, and my project aims to inform how they were concealed. Thank you, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Well, thank you to Taylor, and thank you to all of our panelists for what were 8 really, I think, remarkable and engaged and sharp and generous talks. Also, everybody was on time. So as a moderator, you know, I'm so happy. I want to quickly just ask if anybody from the panel has anything that they might like to respond to some of the other speakers, and then we can open things up to the rest of the Zoom room. We have almost 90 people with us online today, which is also a gift of your time and your presence, and we're honored by that. We are going to be using the Q&A function on Zoom for questions. So I'll ask that you note down your questions, and then I will read them to the panelists. We have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, and I just want to start with the first one, who is from J. Gary Myers, and it's for Valerie. And the question is about the valuable and well-researched book, ditto that, Prairie Fairies. The book is such an important contribution to Canadian queer history and education. We've already used the book in 2 of our queer and women's gender and sexuality history courses at York University. In the book, you made it clear that there were challenges in finding more women and Indigenous queers to interview. What might you do differently now to ensure that more women and Indigenous queer voices can be included in future work for Canadian historians?
Thanks very much for that question, Gary. And I'm pleased to hear that you're signing the book in Toronto, so that's wonderful. So what I would do now, I would do a couple things. The first is that I would partner with some Indigenous organizations and communities to enable myself and a colleague to better find oral informants and to make that a more comfortable process and a more inclusive process. I didn't initially, I didn't think I would struggle as much as I did to find people to interview. And so many years on in that process, and that's the benefit of being a fully tenured prof when I took this on, slow scholarship. I had a decade to try and find people to talk to. And so it really took a long, long time to build up a sense of confidence in me, that people got to know me. And I benefited from oral interviews that other people did. So I would find Indigenous colleagues and activists to work with. Who could, have better access to and better knowledge of those communities, and not presume this was something that I myself, as a settler historian in the prairies, could access too easily. So some learning there. In terms of the women, that proved to be a bit more challenging. I think, my glib answer to that always is to say I would have designed the project entirely differently, because I would have written about curling or hockey or golf or baseball in the prairies. And then I would have interviewed all those women, and I would have had questions about sexuality and partners as, a category. So the research design put them off. They were out there. They knew about the book. They've bought the book. Some of them have read the book and even told me how much they love the book, but they wouldn't talk to me for the book. So, partly it was research design, partly it was being a resident of the same community where there is a group of people who were resistant to being interviewed. And I think they felt very uncomfortable with that. So maybe if I was based elsewhere, it wouldn't be so, so much of a small town. There's like half a degree of separation between everyone that lives and works in Saskatoon. And I think that also made people uncomfortable. So, I think those are some strategies that I would have employed if I had realized how problematic it was going to be to get lesbians to talk to me about their experiences. So thank you very much for that question, and again for reading and engaging with the book. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the question and for the answer there. I want to move on to a question from Isabel Campbell. And what they comment here is that they enjoyed the stories of personal struggles as historians have challenged old ideas in these areas over time. As a military and naval historian, I'm seeing exciting new developments in my area and movement among younger scholars to get past old boundaries and utilize intersectionality to explore military and naval topics. I think that the history war has created harm, preventing some scholars from utilizing these lenses in my field. What Taylor talked about is even more evident in this field. Does any panelist want to talk about creating safe academic spaces for people exploring military and naval topics with a feminist and intersectional lens? So that is open to anybody who would like to address that question.
I can jump in as I guess one of the newer cohorts of historians on here who's also working in a historically male-dominated field. I think creating a safe academic space is essentially how we choose to move forward with our methodology. But I think it's important that we utilize some of, oral history, for example, privileging voices that weren't necessarily written into the conventional historical narrative. But in terms of safe, I think that's a risk we take as historians. As I said, we're always walking a tightrope between subjectivity and objectivity. So I would want to kind of know a little bit more about what the definition of safe is. And I'm happy to talk with you about that. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to talk about some of the things that I'm battling in this field in legal history, for example. So thanks for your question.
Thank you. Anybody else want to engage that? Okay. And I think one of the things that I've noticed about somebody who pays a little bit is how much interesting work that borders on kind of questions of military is actually coming out of Indigenous history as well. And so I think that is an interesting way to see maybe how that may or may not shift those things. Another question from Marcia Browndy. And the question is, how are Canadian historians and queer folks responding to the war on gender and sexuality going on in municipalities, where there's removing books and disciplining teachers who speak of these issues in the classroom? So again, is there anybody who might speak to the connections between queer histories and those on the ground politics, particularly at a municipal level? Okay, we can maybe come back to that one as well. But again, I think one of the things that came up throughout all of these presentations is the connection between history as kind of a historical practice and a lived experience of politics and activism. And this is yet another way that we see these things occurring. Rebecca, do you want to speak to that? Just your response that you got there in the chat.
Sure, just to go back to Marcia's question about the removal of books. So I trained as a librarian at University of Toronto. We know that marginalized voices in literature are the first and hottest targeted when it comes to book banning. We've seen that with Mouse being taken off the shelf in Tennessee last week or the week before. And really, any time that a library or a school decides to teach material about, particularly these days, trans and non-binary characters and experiences, but in the past we've seen Black, we've seen Indigenous, we've seen all sorts of narratives being removed from the shelves, and I really think that there's a professional response to that through the American Library Association, which also covers some Canadian library programs, and there's also a continued community response, and I do think that the removal of Mouse, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel about the Holocaust, if that shows us anything, it's just how necessary books like that are for children and for other readers. So I do think it's a push and pull. And I would also say that if my historical understanding of the protest cycles of the 1960s, the gay liberation movement, of lesbian feminism and feminism more large has taught us that the fight against the right, against the conservative right and censorship is always ongoing. So book banning is something that you will see ramp up in times where authoritarianism is also creeping up. So we see that in cycles of history.
Thank you for that. I have a next question here from Joy Dixon. And they write, thank you to all the panelists for some provocative and thoughtful presentations. It strikes me that the field is in a time of transition right now, away from approaches in social and cultural history that have dominated the discipline for more than a generation. It reminds me of debates in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the debate was often framed in terms of women's versus gender history, or gay and lesbian histories versus queer theory, critical histories of sexuality. I would be interested in hearing the panelists talk about whether they also experience this moment as a time of shifting. And if so, of their thoughts on the limitations and possibilities of different new approaches and critiques. So that is a question that is open to any of our panelists to take on, about whether you experience this as a moment of shifting and what are the limits and the possibilities of that shift.
It really revolved a lot around the discourse approach to history, and there were so many debates about Joan Scott's work and about the use of the term gender, of course, was something that we did gradually adapt. She wasn't the first to suggest it, but certainly one of the more powerful voices. But I think it did cause a lot of discontent, shall we say, among some of us who thought that one needed to stick with some of the material aspects, materialist kind of analysis, that maybe it would be difficult to combine the two, the sort of theoretical discourse, the theory of discourse, with the more, well, frankly, Marxist understanding of history, which is where a number of us have come from. But I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, we began to see that the social, cultural, political constructs were important as well as the economics. But it did cause, yes, I think it caused quite a debate, and it changed the field, you know, quite a bit.
I'll jump in. As someone who actually didn't live the first, transition of feminist thought or, gender thinking, I can only imagine how it operated in 1986 when Joan Scott came forward with, this gender as a category of historical analysis. So my professors taught me in my gender history courses. But I think this comes from Joan's newest work, Demanding Equality, specifically with looking at the resurgence of feminist voices as being more of a polyphonic radio wave rather than a wave, I think is actually evidence of a physical shift in how we think about gender or race and class and how they all intersect. And as historians, I think it's actually a really useful lens to think about. Now, I'm also familiar with the debate in left history that Joan started in the 90s. And I think that's also important to kind of, I'm sorry, Joan, I'm calling upon you a few times now. But I think it's important because if it actually informs how we should aim to do our analytical work and move forward, which I do see as a shift, but I could be wrong. For some of, I don't know if we all noticed, but this panel was organized in a chronological nature. Historians wanting to do things in chronological order is extremely typical. But I think it's important to, talk about how the field itself shifted, but also I think, and I hope that we're moving into a new shift in the way in which we approach things, but also getting back to what Rebecca kind of called upon with this like really nitty-gritty historical analysis of the first people kind of doing that work in that specific time in the late 20th century. So I think we're moving in that direction. So I see a shift, but I open it up to the other panelists if you also want to jump in here. And I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
I think it's a really great question, Joy. And this is one of those questions where I wish this was an environment where we could turn this around. And I could ask you, do you think, are you experiencing this as a shift? I think that there are, from within the history of sexuality at any rate, right, there are the challenges being posed by transgender history and by Indigenous Two-Spirit histories. But I'm not experiencing those, I'm just speaking personally, obviously, as the kind of shift and debate that you've referenced, like in the 80s and 90s, and I have no desire myself to go back and relive those or revisit those. So that it's the shift isn't, what am I trying to say? I don't experience it as a shift. I feel it's more like an opening up, and there is a dialogue going on between these different subfields. And my concern, as I think maybe was clear in from my comments today, is less about a shift, like an intellectual or a theoretical shift, and more about what I detect as a kind of depoliticization of some of the work in the history of sexuality that I find worrisome. But I wish we could hear what you said.
Thank you. I'll pass things over to Joan, and then maybe we can hear more from Joy too.
I don't want to go back to some of those debates, but I guess I don't see that shift so much. So I'd like to hear more about how that's perceived, that shift away from social and cultural history. But I just want to go back to something I ended with that I think is really good to keep thinking about. And that's thinking always about avoiding progress narratives. And that phrase is actually taken from Claire Hemming's book, which is, what's it called? Stories That Matter. It's very interesting. And it's about how feminist theory later on looked back and described feminist theory of the 70s and the 80s. And one of the narratives that predominates is the narrative of progress. Well, now we've moved on to a more complex, view, whereas then they only did this, this, and this. And it is very strong, I think. And it's a tendency that we all have because we're hopeful. We hope things are getting better. We hope they're getting more nuanced. We hope that we're opening up the field in new ways. But I think we can also get caught in this wig view of history and feminist history that can be rather problematic if we don't always question it. So some of you mentioned intersectionality. I find often writing now simply assumes that's the best theory, because before it was, it wasn't good. It was this, this, and this. It was all these negative things. And so what I think we always have to do is keep asking questions about this progress narrative and new theory, which some of you can imagine, I don't always think is better theory. I think sometimes we go backwards and forwards with theoretical advances. So it's not a wig view of history. It's not in relation to anything, but really specific, but I think it's something to keep in mind because it also keeps debate always open about our methods and our theory and our assumptions, which makes our history writing better too.
Well, thank you for those really rich comments. I'll also note that Joy Dixon has added a few other really important remarks in the chat there. I'll just ask your attention to be drawn there. We're going over time now, and I am always aware that that's always a bit of a tricky exercise. So I'm going to ask that we begin to draw this event to a close. I will note that this is the start of a conversation that the CHA is organizing to mark, to engage, to grapple with the sort of a lived experience of doing the work of history, broadly conceived around the context of the 100th anniversary of the organization. So stay tuned for future webinars, including an important one coming up on organized particularly around questions of Indigenous historians and Indigenous histories. I would like to finally thank Michelle Duquet from CHA office, Joe McCutcheon, Letitia Johnson, and Allison Stevenson for all the hard work in putting together what was a really remarkable panel. I was honored to sit here and keep track of time and occasionally mute and unmute myself. And I'm honored for everyone who made time in their schedules to be a part of this. So thank you very much to all the panelists and all the audiences, and we will see you at the next in this series. Thank you very much.